The CEO of one of the most powerful companies in the country walked into a bustling restaurant only to freeze when he saw his ex-wife standing in the corner, begging for food to feed her two young twin daughters. He hadn't seen her in years, but the desperation in her eyes stopped him in his tracks. How had it come to this? What had happened to the woman he once knew? If this story stirs something deep within you, stick with us. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts. It's more meaningful than you might think. Jack Thompson sat in the penthouse restaurant of a luxury hotel in Chicago, his fingers absent-mindedly tapping the rim of his glass. He had everything: money, power, respect, but the wealth that surrounded him seemed hollow. From his vantage point, he could see the world below him, the busy streets of the city where ordinary people lived their daily lives. His gaze drifted, as it often did, over the people down there, none of them particularly important, none of them part of his world. But then something caught his eye, something out of place in the usual buzz of the crowd. There, on the sidewalk just below the hotel, stood a woman, Sophie, his ex-wife. Jack froze, his heart skipping a beat. It had been years since he last saw her, and back then, she was the epitome of grace and wealth. Now, she was crouching on the pavement, pleading with passers-by. Beside her, two little girls stood. Their faces were turned toward the ground, their hands held tightly by Sophie. The sight jarred Jack to his core. He leaned forward, squinting against the sun's glare. The girls, there was something about them. The longer he looked, the more their features became familiar, startlingly so. His heart raced as he noticed their eyes, their hair, everything about them screamed resemblance. The girls were his. They had to be Sophie, once a radiant figure beside him at glamorous parties and exclusive events, now appeared fragile, worn down by life. Her clothes were tattered, and her once carefully maintained appearance now seemed disheveled. Jack's thoughts raced. How had it come to this? How could she, the woman he had known to be proud and dignified, now be begging on the streets? He took a deep breath, trying to calm the chaos stirring inside him. He couldn't just sit there. He stood abruptly, knocking his chair back in the process, drawing curious looks from nearby diners. Jack didn't notice. His focus was on Sophie, on those girls, his daughters, he thought, his heart heavy with guilt and disbelief. He made his way out of the restaurant, his mind in a whirlwind. He pushed past the front desk, barely registering the greeting from the hotel staff. He headed toward the elevators, unable to shake the image of Sophie, her face strained with worry. He needed to get down there, to confront her, to find out everything. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, and he pressed the button for the lobby. Each floor seemed to descend more slowly than the last, as though his anxiety was creating a force that resisted gravity. When the doors opened, he practically ran toward the exit, stepping out into the cool air of Chicago's downtown. He scanned the sidewalk frantically, his eyes darting between the people walking by. But Sophie and the girls were gone. His heart pounded in his chest as he walked faster, then jogged, pushing past pedestrians. There were no signs of them, just the usual crowd milling about, some staring at their phones, others lost in conversation. He slowed to a stop, his eyes wide, his breath heavy. Where had they gone? Jack's mind spun with questions he hadn't even begun to answer. He had two daughters he didn't know about. Sophie had kept them from him, or perhaps he had kept himself from them. How had this all been hidden from him for so long, and why hadn't Sophie reached out? He glanced around one more time, but there was no sign of Sophie or the girls. They had vanished as quickly as they had appeared. The world around him seemed unchanged, but Jack was not. He stood frozen, caught between his disbelief and a deep-seated guilt that was now gnawing at him. His mind raced through the possibilities, none of which made sense. Why hadn't Sophie contacted him? Why had she chosen to suffer alone with their children? He could feel the weight of his choices pressing down on him, each decision in his past now laid bare in the face of his newfound reality. He had always thought that success and power were the answers to everything, but now, standing in the middle of the city, He realized how wrong he had been. The sounds of the city around him seemed muted, drowned out by the pounding in his head. The simple truth was undeniable. He had a family he had never known. And now, they were gone, lost to him before he had even known they existed. Get it together, Jack, he muttered to himself, taking a deep breath. He needed answers, and he wasn't going to find them standing there. He needed to find Sophie. But how, where Jack stepped forward, his steps uncertain but determined, his mind set on one thing, finding the truth. And the truth, he knew, was just as elusive as the figures that had disappeared into the crowd. As he walked down the street, thoughts clouding his mind, he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same again. Jack Thompson leaned back in his leather chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically against the polished surface of his desk. He gazed out the large glass window of his corner office in Thompson Enterprises, watching the rush of the city below. Chicago, the heart of his empire, hummed with life. But inside him, everything was still. Despite his success, Jack felt a growing emptiness gnawing at him. The events from earlier that day, the sight of Sophie, kneeling on the cold sidewalk, begging for help with two small girls at her side, lingered in his mind like a bad memory that refused to fade. He had tried to dismiss it. It was just a momentary lapse in his day, nothing more than a distraction. Sophie was his past, a chapter he had closed years ago. But as he sat in his office, the busy buzz of calls and meetings surrounding him, the image of Sophie and those two girls kept resurfacing. He couldn't ignore it, no matter how hard he tried. The very idea of Sophie in such a state, in such desperation, didn't sit right with him. He had known her as someone with dignity, someone proud, someone who never needed to ask for help. And now she was on the streets, begging. It didn't make sense. How had it come to this? Jack stood up abruptly, the sharp movement causing his chair to scrape against the floor. He walked to the window, the city sprawling out before him, but he didn't see the traffic or the people. All he could see was Sophie's face, tired and worn, her eyes pleading. The image of the girls stood out the most, their faces almost hauntingly familiar. The more he thought about it, the more certain he became. They had his eyes, his features. They were his daughters. But why had she never told him? Why hadn't Sophie reached out? The questions swirled in his mind, but Jack couldn't answer any of them. Sophie had moved on. She had her life, and he had his. The distance between them had grown over the years, built by misunderstandings, time, and his own neglect. Yet now, this unexpected encounter threatened to unravel everything. Sitting back down at his desk, Jack tried to refocus on the piles of paperwork in front of him, but his mind refused to cooperate. He felt torn, his responsibilities pulling him in one direction, and the guilt and confusion about Sophie pulling him in another. There was a part of him that wanted to go after her, to find her, to get the answers that were gnawing at him. But another part of him hesitated, afraid of what he might discover, of what might happen if he did. As the day stretched on, Jack's thoughts kept drifting back to that moment on the sidewalk. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had missed something important, something fundamental. Was Sophie still the woman he had known, or had the years and the struggles changed her beyond recognition? And if those girls were truly his, what kind of father had he been to them? The questions felt heavy, and Jack realized with a jolt that he didn't have the answers. He didn't even know where to start looking. The elevator ride down from his office to the main lobby felt longer than it actually was, as if time had slowed just enough for him to reconsider his choices. Jack ran his hand through his hair, his eyes fixed on the elevator doors. Sophie had made her decisions, and he had made his. They had both moved on, each with their own life. Why then did he feel this undeniable pull to find out more, to dig deeper into a past he had long buried just then, as he walked into the conference room for a scheduled meeting with his business partners? His phone buzzed in his pocket. It was a message from Sophie. Jack froze for a moment, the words flashing on his screen. "We need to talk. It's about the girls." His heart skipped a beat. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected to hear from her so soon. Was this an invitation to talk? Or was it a plea for help? Was she reaching out? Or was this a way to keep their distance? To finally let him know everything she had kept hidden? As he stood there, in the midst of his high-powered meeting, Jack's thoughts were no longer on the deals in front of him. His mind raced with the weight of the message. For the first time in years, he couldn't ignore what was right in front of him. Sophie had reached out, and for reasons he couldn't yet explain, Jack knew he had to respond. He quickly typed a reply, where and when, before he could put the phone down. The door to the conference room opened, and his colleagues walked in, their voices filling the space. But Jack barely heard them. His focus was on one thing now, Sophie. And what she had to say. Jack Thompson had spent most of his life in spaces of power and wealth. But today, his presence felt out of place. He wasn't in his office or a conference room filled with expensive suits and polished executives. He was at a community center in Chicago, a place Sophie had devoted so much of her time to after their divorce. His shoes clicked against the tiled floor as he walked through the center's entrance, the smell of freshly baked goods and the buzz of children's voices filling the air. The center was a far cry from the luxury of his penthouse, and yet there was a warmth to it that made him feel uneasy. Sophie was standing by a small table in the back, sorting through donations. She didn't see him approach, too focused on her task. But Jack couldn't take his eyes off her. The years had been kind to Sophie. In some ways, she still had that same grace, that quiet dignity that had once made her the perfect partner. But there was something different about her now, something that spoke of struggle. Her clothes were modest, worn, not the designer brands she used to wear, but something simpler, more practical. And there was a hardness in her eyes that Jack hadn't seen before. It didn't take long for her to sense his presence. She paused, her back still to him, but her shoulders tensed. Sophie turned around slowly, her gaze locking onto his. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The tension between them was palpable, thicker than the air in the room. Jack could see that she wasn't happy to see him, but she didn't walk away, which Jack took as a small sign of concession. "Jack," Sophie said, her voice steady, but there was an edge to it, something distant. She wasn't smiling. "Sophie," Jack replied, his voice unsteady despite himself. He couldn't remember the last time he had seen her like this vulnerable, not the composed woman he had known in their past. "Are you here to see the center?" she asked, her eyes flicking to the kids running around behind her. "We've got a fundraiser going on." Her tone was dismissive, almost like she was trying to push him away. Jack felt it, like a slap to his chest. Jack cleared his throat, stepping closer, trying to close the gap between them. "I came to talk about what happened earlier." Sophie's face tightened. "I don't think there's much to talk about." She turned back to the table, grabbing another pile of donations, clearly trying to end the conversation. But Jack wasn't ready to let it go. He couldn't just walk away again. Not now, not after everything that had been left unsaid for so long. "I saw you, Sophie," Jack said, taking a step forward. "You were begging for help. With the girls. Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you?" He stopped himself before he could ask the real question. Why hadn't you let me be a part of their lives? Sophie stiffened, her fingers gripping the edge of the table. She took a deep breath and then met his gaze, her eyes searching his for a moment. "You don't get it, Jack. You don't get it because you've never had to. You've always had everything." Her voice broke for a fraction of a second, but she quickly regained control. "I didn't want this for them, but they're mine. They're my responsibility." Her gaze softened as she glanced toward the children in the corner of the room, oblivious to their mother's pain. "And you haven't been part of their lives. I tried to reach out, but you were too busy." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. He couldn't refute it. He hadn't been there for them, for her. He hadn't been there when they needed him the most. The guilt he had been running from hit him like a brick wall. The harsh reality of Sophie's words settled heavily in his chest. "I know," he whispered, the admission tasting bitter on his tongue. I should have been there. I should have tried harder, but I didn't know. Sophie turned back to the donations, her face hardening again. It doesn't matter now. What's done is done. Jack stood in silence, watching her, trying to find the words to say, but everything felt wrong. The distance between them, built over years of neglect and silence, was too great. And yet, in that moment, standing in the middle of the community center, surrounded by the warmth and chaos of the world Sophie had chosen to embrace, Jack realized that he still cared, that he had always cared. He looked at Sophie, really looked at her, and saw a woman who had fought alone for years, doing whatever it took to survive, to give her children a future. Jack had never truly seen her until now. I want to make this right, Jack said softly, his voice thick with emotion. I know I can't change the past, but I want to try. For the girls. For you. Sophie didn't respond at first. She kept her back turned to him, her hands now resting on the table. Jack couldn't read her expression, but he didn't need to. He just needed to show her that he was here now, that he wasn't going to walk away again. Finally. Sophie turned around, her eyes meeting his, and for a brief moment, Jack thought he saw something soften in her gaze. Maybe it was just a flicker of hope, a small crack in the wall she had built around herself. You can't just say it, Jack, she said quietly, her voice almost too soft to hear. You have to show it. Jack nodded. I will. I'll show you. She didn't say anything else, but there was something in the way she looked at him that made him think she was starting to believe it, even if only a little. Jack stepped back, his mind racing. The air between them felt charged, thick with the weight of everything they had said and everything they hadn't. But he knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let her go again. Not like this. As he walked out of the community center, Jack glanced back over his shoulder. Sophie was still standing there, her eyes following him, but she didn't call after him. She didn't need to. He knew he had just taken the first step. Jack Thompson sat in the glass-walled conference room of Thompson Enterprises, the room illuminated by the early afternoon sun. The voices of his business partners filled the air as they discussed the latest expansion plans. Jack wasn't really listening. His mind kept drifting back to the community center, to Sophie, and to the sight of the two girls standing beside her. His thoughts were heavy, tangled in guilt and confusion. How had he been so blind? How had he never known? The questions gnawed at him. Even as he sat at the head of the table, his business persona in full force, he was on autopilot, nodding in agreement as his partners spoke about projections and strategies. But none of it mattered. Sophie, and those two girls, were all that filled his mind. He couldn't shake the image of them from his thoughts. Sophie, once so vibrant, now reduced to begging on the street, and the girls, so clearly his daughters, standing there, oblivious to the man who should have been their father. As the meeting came to an end, Jack stood up, his mind still a whirlpool of questions. He needed answers. He needed to understand how everything had slipped through his fingers. The guilt was suffocating, a weight he couldn't shake. He stepped out of the conference room and made his way to his office, his shoes clicking against the marble floors. Sitting down at his desk, he found his gaze drifting toward the window. The skyline of Chicago stretched out before him, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He picked up a stack of papers that had been waiting for his attention. It was a mix of contracts, numbers, and projections, things that had always consumed him. But today, it felt insignificant. His hand froze as his eyes fell on a framed photo sitting at the corner of his desk. It was an old picture, taken on their wedding day. Sophie was smiling at him, radiant, the picture of a happy couple. He hadn't looked at it in years, but now it was like a punch to the gut. How had they ended up here? With so much unspoken between them, Jack's fingers tightened around the edge of the photo as he set it down. That's when he noticed the envelope underneath it. It was small, tucked neatly in the corner, with no name or return address. He pulled it out, feeling a twinge of dread as he opened it. Inside was a folded piece of paper, yellowed with age. As he unfolded it, he saw a photograph, a picture of Sophie, the two girls, and a man Jack didn't recognize. But it wasn't the man who caught his attention. It was the girls, the unmistakable resemblance to him. His heart stopped. There was no doubt about it. These were his children. The realization hit him like a tidal wave, knocking him off balance. Sophie had tried to contact him. She had sent him this picture, trying to reach out, but he had never responded. He had ignored her, ignored his own flesh and blood. Jack sat back in his chair, the weight of the photo pressing down on him. He had missed so much. How many birthdays had passed? How many moments had he let slip away? Thinking his success meant everything, Sophie had struggled alone, raising their children while he had been busy building his empire, the very empire that now felt so empty. As he sat there, the office around him felt colder, the silence louder. He had spent years denying that he needed anything outside of work, outside of his career. But now, faced with the reality of his past, he saw how wrong he had been. He wasn't just a businessman, he was a father, and he had been absent for so long. The emotions inside him swelled guilt, regret, and the overwhelming desire to make things right. But where did he start? What could he possibly say to Sophie after all this time? She had built a life without him, and here he was, a stranger to the very family he should have been a part of. Jack stood up suddenly, pacing around the room. His hands ran through his hair as his thoughts spiraled. He wanted to call her, to apologize, to explain everything. But how could he? What if she didn't want him in her life anymore? What if the girls didn't even remember him? His phone buzzed, snapping him out of his thoughts. The message was from Sophie. "We need to talk. It's about the girls." Jack stared at the message for a long moment, his heart racing. Sophie had reached out to him. She had finally contacted him. And now, for the first time in years, he had a chance to make things right. But what could he say? How could he possibly make up for the years he had lost? He quickly typed a response, where and when he hit send, his fingers trembling as he placed the phone down. The wait felt like an eternity. He had no idea what Sophie would say, but he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't ignore her again. He couldn't ignore them. As the minutes ticked by, Jack's thoughts returned to the photograph. He had spent so long focused on the wrong things, thinking success and wealth would bring him happiness. But now, he realized it wasn't money or power that mattered. It was family. It was the children he never knew he had, the children who had been right under his nose all this time. The phone buzzed again, pulling him out of his reverie. It was Sophie's reply. "Meet me at the park. I'll be there at noon." The words hung in the air, heavy with the promise of confrontation, of healing, of the unknown. Jack's heart raced as he stood up from his desk. He knew he had to go. He had to face Sophie, face his daughters, and face the consequences of his past actions. He grabbed his coat, his mind already racing ahead to what he would say. But deep down, he knew there was no easy way to fix this. No simple words that could make up for all the years he had missed. The only thing he could do now was show up, be present, and start the long road to redemption. As Jack stepped out of the office, the weight on his chest felt a little lighter, but the journey ahead would be anything but easy. The days following his encounter with Sophie weighed heavily on Jack Thompson. His mind would not release the image of her, standing on the street corner, pleading for help. The girls, his daughters, were real, and the reality of their existence was something Jack could no longer deny. His life had been a world of boardrooms, decisions made in the blink of an eye, and the constant hum of high-stakes business. But now, everything seemed different. The fast-paced world that he had once embraced so fully seemed so irrelevant compared to the family he never knew he had. Jack sat at his desk in his sleek office, the sun setting outside his floor-to-ceiling windows, casting a golden light across the room. He absent-mindedly scrolled through emails, none of which registered in his mind. His thoughts were consumed by Sophie and the two girls. He had so many questions, but the one that haunted him the most was simple. How had he missed it all? He couldn't shake the guilt that gnawed at him like a silent whisper in the back of his mind. Sophie had been struggling, raising their children on her own, and he hadn't even known. He hadn't even thought to look for them. For years, he had buried himself in his work, convinced that his success would somehow make him happy. But now, in the silence of his office, he realized that success had come at a great cost. Jack made a decision. He couldn't sit idly by any longer, not when he knew what he had to do. He needed to see Sophie again, to at least make an attempt at helping her, to show her that he was willing to change. He wasn't sure what kind of help he could offer, but he couldn't just ignore the situation. Not again. The next morning, he found himself outside the same community center where he had first seen Sophie. It was a modest building, nothing like the gleaming skyscrapers he was used to, but there was a warmth about it, a sense of purpose. Jack walked in, the door creaking softly as he entered, and was immediately met by the scent of freshly brewed coffee and the sound of children laughing. Sophie was there, of course, working with volunteers, arranging donations, and managing the day-to-day tasks of the center. She didn't see him approach. Her attention focused on the task at hand. Jack hesitated for a moment, unsure of how to approach her. He didn't want to intrude, didn't want to make her feel uncomfortable. But this wasn't about his comfort. It was about his responsibility. Finally, he cleared his throat, causing Sophie to turn her head. When their eyes met, Jack could see the hesitation in her gaze, the wall she had built up around herself. She knew exactly who he was, but there was a distance between them, a gap that hadn't existed the last time they had spoken. "Jack," she said, her voice neutral, but not unkind. She wasn't smiling, but she wasn't angry either. It was the calm indifference of someone who had learned to survive without expecting anything from the person standing before them. "Sophie," Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. "I wanted to talk about everything." Sophie nodded slowly, stepping aside to let him into the small office area where she was working. "I don't know what there is to talk about. Jack, we both know where we stand." Jack watched her, feeling a wave of guilt wash over him. The years had changed her, but it wasn't just the hardship she had endured that made her different. It was the way she had learned to carry it all, alone, without ever asking for help. The weight of her world was evident in the way she held herself strong, yet fragile, a woman who had been forced to grow up far too fast. "I saw you yesterday with the girls," Jack said quietly, watching Sophie's expression harden slightly. "I don't know what I was expecting, but I'm sorry. I didn't realize how much I've missed." Sophie's eyes flickered briefly, her face softening for a second before she regained her composure. "You weren't the only one who missed things, Jack." Her words stung, but Jack didn't flinch. "I've been trying to hold it all together, for them, but it's hard, you know. You can't imagine what it's like." Jack stepped forward, his heart aching at the rawness in her voice. He wanted to tell her that he understood, that he was here to help. But he knew it wasn't that simple. He had never been there when she needed him most, and no matter how many times he said, "I'm sorry," it wouldn't change the years of absence. "Is there anything I can do?" Jack asked, his voice soft, almost a whisper. He didn't know if he was asking for her or for himself. Sophie paused, her eyes darting to the window, avoiding his gaze. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I don't want you to feel like you have to do something. Jack, I'm not asking for help. I'm just living. I'm just trying to survive." Jack's throat tightened. He had been so wrong, so selfish all these years. He could see now how much Sophie had sacrificed, how much she had suffered in silence. The weight of it all seemed to press down on him, making it hard to breathe. "You don't have to do this alone," Jack said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm here now. I'll help. However I can." Sophie didn't respond right away. She turned her back to him, her shoulders sagging slightly as she ran her fingers over a pile of papers on the desk. Jack could see the struggle in her posture, the conflict between wanting to accept help and the fear of being disappointed again. "I don't want you to feel like you have to," Sophie repeated, her voice steady but tinged with sadness. "I don't need you to take responsibility for something you've never been a part of." Her words stung, and Jack knew she was right. He had never been there, never stepped up, never done the work. But that didn't mean he couldn't try now. "I'm not asking for anything." "Sophie," Jack said, his voice firm with a quiet resolve. "I just want to be there for you, for the girls." Sophie turned away from him, but Jack saw her eyes glisten, her breath shaky as if she was on the verge of tears. She bit her lip, and for a moment, Jack thought she might break down. But instead, she took a deep breath, composed herself, and said, "I don't want you to feel responsible for this. Please." Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He wanted to argue, wanted to tell her that he was ready to be the father they deserved, but he knew better than to force her into something she wasn't ready for. "I'm not going anywhere," Jack finally said, his voice soft but steady. "We'll take this one step at a time." Sophie didn't reply. She simply turned away, as if to say goodbye, but Jack didn't move. He stayed there, standing in the small room, the weight of the moment hanging in the air between them. As Jack left the community center, he couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, but it wasn't enough. Not yet. He would do whatever it took to prove to Sophie and to himself that he could be the father he had never been. But he knew, in that moment, that it wouldn't be easy. Not by any means. Jack Thompson stood in the middle of the community center, watching Sophie work. Her hands moved swiftly, sorting through stacks of donation boxes with an efficiency that Jack admired. It was as if she had made this place her life, her sanctuary. There was a quiet strength about her that Jack hadn't noticed before, a resilience that seemed to hold her together no matter what life threw her way. And now, for the first time in a long time, Jack was standing here beside her, offering help where he could. After their last conversation, Jack had realized that his life had been built on the wrong things. For years, he had focused on success, on money, on power. But when he saw Sophie again, when he saw his daughters, something inside him shifted. He could no longer stay on the sidelines. He could no longer let Sophie carry everything on her own. She had been strong for so long, but Jack knew he had to step in, even if it was just to help with small things. Jack wasn't used to this kind of life, this world of community centers, children in need, and families struggling to make ends meet. But he was learning. He had started with small gestures, offering to help set up for events, running errands, and even fixing things around the center. Sophie had been surprised at first, but she hadn't pushed him away. She had simply watched him, her eyes studying him, perhaps wondering how long this would last. It wasn't much, but Jack was beginning to feel a connection to Sophie, to the life she had built. And as the days went by, he found himself looking forward to spending time with her, helping out, and seeing her smile, something he hadn't seen in a long time. One afternoon, they found themselves working together to organize a fundraising event for the center. The project had run into a few hurdles, but they tackled each problem with quiet determination. Jack found himself laughing with Sophie for the first time in years, the sound of their shared laughter filling the space between them. It felt so natural, so easy, that for a brief moment, Jack forgot about the walls that had always separated them. There were no business meetings, no grand decisions to make, just two people working side by side, solving problems together. Sophie's face softened as she glanced at him, and Jack saw a flicker of something he hadn't seen in her before. It wasn't the wariness that had defined their interactions in the past. This was different, more relaxed, more open. They were in sync, in a way that neither of them had been before. "I think we've got it all sorted," Sophie said, wiping a bead of sweat from her forehead. She smiled, and for a moment, Jack could see the woman he had once loved, the woman who had been so full of life and promise. Jack smiled back, the weight of everything he had been carrying lifting just a little. "I think so, too. We make a good team, don't we?" Sophie raised an eyebrow, but her smile lingered. "I suppose we do." For the first time, Jack felt a sense of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something. They weren't the same people they had been when they first met, But they didn't have to be. The past couldn't be erased, but it could be acknowledged. And in that acknowledgement, there was a possibility for something new. Maybe not love, not yet, but certainly respect, understanding, and perhaps, over time, trust. As they stood there, taking a moment to enjoy their small victory, Jack felt something shift inside him. The walls he had built up around himself were crumbling. His life had always been about control, about knowing exactly where he was headed and how to get there. But with Sophie and the girls, there was no blueprint, no roadmap. There was only the present, only the quiet moments when they could work together and build something new. Just as they were about to call it a day, a young woman from the volunteer team walked by, her eyes flicking from Jack to Sophie, a knowing look passing between them. She paused for a moment, as if unsure of whether or not to speak. Then, in a hushed voice, she murmured, "Is there something going on between you two? I mean, you seem close." Sophie quickly turned away, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Jack felt a rush of embarrassment, but it was quickly replaced by a sense of warmth. The thought of Sophie opening up to him, even just a little, made him feel like they were making progress, however small it might be. Sophie cleared her throat, brushing her hair from her face. "We're just working together, nothing more." But Jack noticed the way her voice faltered, the way she avoided meeting his eyes. For a moment, he wondered if he had misread the situation. Had he crossed a line? Was she pulling away from him again before he could ask? Sophie turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I have to go," she said quietly. "There's more to do. I'll see you later." And just like that, she walked away, leaving Jack standing there, his heart heavy with the uncertainty of what had just happened. Jack watched Sophie disappear into the crowd, his thoughts swirling. He didn't want to push her. He knew that trust couldn't be built overnight. But something inside him told him that this small moment, this shared laugh, was a step in the right direction. They had started to connect, to find common ground. But Sophie was still guarded, still unsure of how much she could let him in. As the evening wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. It wasn't just the laughter, or the work they had done together. It was the way they had been able to share that moment, without the weight of their past hanging over them. For the first time, Jack felt like they were on equal footing, like they could start anew. But as he left the community center that night, Jack couldn't help but feel that Sophie was still holding something back, something she wasn't ready to share, something that made her hesitate every time he got too close. He didn't know what it was, but he knew he had to find out. The lights of the city twinkled outside Jack Thompson's office window, but inside, the usual buzz of the Thompson Enterprises headquarters felt distant. The phone calls, the meetings, the negotiations, none of it seemed to matter as much as it had just a few weeks ago. Jack had found himself spending more time thinking about Sophie, about his daughters, and about how everything he thought he knew about success had been turned upside down. The people in his life had started noticing the change. His colleagues had begun to ask questions, their voices laced with curiosity and subtle judgment. Where had the sharp, driven CEO gone? Why had Jack suddenly become so distracted? He had always been the man who thrived on control, on the details, on ensuring everything was in order. But now, his focus seemed scattered. He had started taking afternoons off, spending them in community centers, helping out at charity events, things he never would have considered before. His personal life, the one he had ignored for so long, was now demanding attention. One of his senior partners, Greg, pulled him aside during a meeting. "Jack, what's going on with you? You're not yourself lately. You used to be the first one in and the last one out. Now, it's like you're somewhere else." Jack had tried to brush it off, offering Greg an easy smile. Just needed a change of pace. "That's all," he'd said. But deep down, he knew the truth. He wasn't sure where he was anymore. The world of high-powered meetings and corporate strategies didn't hold the same meaning for him as it had just a few months ago. What had once been so important felt irrelevant now. He couldn't ignore the truth his family, the ones he had so callously abandoned, were now at the forefront of his mind. But as the days passed, the pressure began to mount. His friends, his family, and his colleagues noticed the shift in him. They began to whisper behind his back. Some even dared to ask if Sophie was the reason for his newfound focus on family. Jack had expected the questions, but they still stung. They reminded him of how much he had been avoiding the truth for years. And the truth was, Sophie and the girls were no longer a distant thought. They were real, and they needed him. Sophie, too, was feeling the weight of their growing connection. Every time Jack reached out, every time they spent time together, she felt herself being pulled closer to him, and yet she resisted. She had spent so many years alone, raising the girls by herself, that allowing Jack back into their lives, into their world, felt like a risk. She was already vulnerable enough, and Jack's presence only made the walls she had built around herself feel thinner. He was a man of power, a man who could easily walk away from any situation when it no longer suited him. She had seen it before in their marriage. The strain between them was palpable, and Sophie knew it. She could sense that Jack was torn between the life he had built for himself and the family he had neglected for so long. But she didn't want to be the cause of any more chaos in his life. He had enough on his plate with the company, and she didn't want him to sacrifice his career for a family he wasn't sure he could be part of. So, Sophie withdrew, quietly pulling away from Jack. She started to cancel plans, finding excuses to keep their time together brief. She told herself it was for the best. She couldn't ask him to walk away from everything he had worked for. She couldn't put that burden on him. But deep down, she wondered if he had changed at all, or if this was just another fleeting moment of guilt. One evening, Jack found himself at a corporate event, one of those glamorous soirees full of wealthy donors and powerful executives. He'd been invited by the board, but the event felt increasingly irrelevant. As Jack navigated the sea of conversation, he felt the familiar, suffocating walls of his old world closing in. The crowd was loud, the air thick with superficial pleasantries, but all he could think about was Sophie. His mind kept drifting back to the community center, back to the last time they had laughed together, when they had been able to forget their past and just exist in the same space, if only for a moment. As Jack scanned the room, he spotted Sophie in the corner, talking to a few people from the charity she had been so involved with. She looked different in this setting, more guarded, more polished. The woman he had seen in the community center, that woman who had opened up to him, seemed miles away. She was standing in a world that was so foreign to him, a world that was completely separate from the business empire he had built. And yet, it was her world. She belonged here too, even if she didn't fit into his world. He couldn't deny that, and it made him feel small. Sophie caught his eye across the room, and for a moment, there was a flicker of recognition in her gaze. But then it was gone, replaced by the familiar walls she had so carefully constructed. She excused herself from the conversation and began to walk toward him. Jack's heart quickened, unsure of what would happen next. "I didn't expect to see you here," Sophie said quietly as she approached, her voice distant. "This isn't exactly your scene." Jack smiled softly, trying to read her expression. "I'm here because I wanted to see you," he said, his voice low but sincere. "I think it's time we talked." "Sophie." Sophie hesitated, glancing around the room as if looking for an escape. "Jack," she started, her voice strained, "I don't want you to think this is easy for me. I've spent so many years building a life without you, and now you want to step back in. But this isn't something you can just walk in and fix." Jack reached out, gently touching her arm, an unspoken plea in his eyes. "I don't want to fix it. I just want to be here, for you, for the girls, for us." Sophie's eyes softened, but only for a moment. She pulled her arm away, the distance between them palpable. "I don't know if that's enough, Jack. You can't just show up and expect everything to be okay. There's so much you don't understand about my life now. My world is different." "I'm willing to learn," Jack said, his voice earnest. "I'm willing to do whatever it takes to make things right." Sophie looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Finally, she sighed and nodded. "Come with me," she said quietly. "I'll show you my world, but you need to be prepared. It's not what you think." Jack followed her, his heart pounding in his chest. As they walked out of the event, he had no idea what Sophie was about to show him, but for the first time, he felt a sense of hope. Maybe this was the first step toward healing, toward understanding. But as they left the building, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that Sophie was still holding something back. The clink of glasses and the hum of laughter filled the high-end restaurant where Jack found himself uncomfortably seated. The event was one Sophie had organized for a local charity, an event where business moguls and the city's elite mingled, laughing over fine wine and expensive hors d'oeuvres. Jack was surrounded by people whose worlds were a far cry from his own. He was a man who had built his empire on meticulous work and tight control. But here, amidst the glittering crowd, he felt like a stranger, out of place and unable to shake the discomfort growing in his chest. He could feel the weight of the stares, the subtle glances. They were intrigued. He knew. Everyone wanted to know why the mighty Jack Thompson, the CEO of Thompson Enterprises, was here at a charity event, of all places. His mind raced. He had come because of Sophie. Because, despite everything, despite the years apart, she was the mother of his children. And now, he was starting to see her differently. He could see how much she had given up, how much of her heart she had poured into the world she had chosen to live in, a world that was so different from the one he had surrounded himself with. Sophie had been busy greeting the donors, exchanging pleasantries with influential figures, but every now and then, she glanced his way. There was something in her eyes, something soft, vulnerable, but tinged with the weight of their past. Jack caught her gaze, and for a moment, he could see the years that had passed between them. There was a moment of connection, but it was fleeting. Sophie turned away quickly, masking the emotion that had crossed her face. Jack looked down at his drink, the clinking of ice in the glass, somehow louder than the conversation swirling around him. He felt a distance growing, not just between himself and Sophie, but between himself and the life he had built. The crowd felt foreign, the discussions of business and luxury irrelevant. He wasn't interested in their fancy cars or million-dollar deals. His thoughts kept drifting back to Sophie, to the life they could have had, to the life he had abandoned. As Jack tried to make small talk with a couple of businessmen at the table, he felt his discomfort mount. His mind was elsewhere, on the community events he had attended with Sophie, on the laughter of the girls, Lily and Ava. They had opened something inside him, something he hadn't known he'd been missing for so long. The corporate world felt distant now, unimportant compared to the real, raw emotions that had been dredged up by their sudden reappearance in his life. A sudden tug at his sleeve snapped him from his thoughts. It was a young child, no older than 5, holding a crayon and a small piece of paper. Jack blinked, surprised, and glanced at Sophie, who stood by the doorway watching the exchange. The little girl looked up at him with wide eyes, her expression earnest. She held up her drawing, and Jack's breath caught in his throat. It was a simple sketch, nothing more than childlike strokes, but in it, there they were, Jack, Sophie, and 2 little girls. The shapes were crude, the figures misshapen, but it was clear who they were. He could make out Sophie's long hair, her gentle smile, and in the middle, 2 little figures, one with blonde hair, the other with brown. One of the girls was holding Jack's hand, and Sophie stood beside them, an image of warmth and love. The child smiled up at him, her innocent eyes full of wonder. "I drew you, mister," she said, her voice soft and sweet. Jack felt a lump form in his throat. He could barely speak, the simple act of the child drawing them together suddenly breaking through the walls he had so carefully built around himself. The simplicity of it, the purity of the gesture, was too much for him. He took the drawing gently, the paper crinkling under his fingers. It was small, but in that moment, it felt like the most important thing in the room. He looked at Sophie, who was standing nearby, her arms crossed over her chest, an unreadable expression on her face. Sophie stepped forward, breaking the spell that had settled over the room. She gently placed her hand on Jack's arm, her touch unexpectedly warm. "She's just a child," Sophie said softly, "but she sees what's real." Jack blinked and nodded, trying to hold back the wave of emotion that was threatening to overwhelm him. He looked down at the drawing once more before folding it carefully, tucking it into his jacket pocket. It was too much to absorb in a single moment. He hadn't realized how badly he'd missed this, how badly he needed to be a part of it. But even as the child's drawing stirred something deep inside him, the differences between him and Sophie felt even more glaring. They lived in completely different worlds. The people around him, the way they spoke, the things they cared about, were all so far removed from the life Sophie had created with the girls. Jack had always been about business, about success, about climbing the ladder. Sophie, on the other hand, had built something real, something that mattered. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't easy, but it was important. Sophie stood there for a moment, watching him, as if waiting for something, but Jack didn't know what to say. He had no words that could bridge the gap between their worlds, between the man he had been and the man he wanted to be. He could feel the weight of the people around them, watching, waiting for him to say something, do something that made sense in their world. But all he could think about was Sophie, and the quiet strength she had shown all these years, raising their daughters, doing the best she could with the hand she had been dealt. Then, in an unexpected turn, Sophie's voice broke the silence. "You don't belong here," she said, her voice low but clear. "Not in this world. You never did. But maybe, just maybe, you're ready to see mine." The words hit Jack harder than he expected. He had come here thinking he could fix things, thinking he could somehow bridge the distance between them. But Sophie's words made it clear that there was no easy fix. There was no quick way to make everything right. But in that moment, Jack realized something he hadn't before. Sophie wasn't asking him to fix everything. She was asking him to show up, to be there, not as a CEO, not as a man of power, but as a father, as a partner. As the weight of her words settled over him, Jack's mind began to race. Could he really step into this world? Could he really be the man he needed to be for Sophie, for the girls, or was he just playing at something he couldn't possibly understand? Sophie turned to leave, but not before adding, "You can't fix me, Jack, but you can try to be a part of our world, if you're ready for it." Jack watched her go, the truth of her words ringing in his ears. He had come here thinking he knew what he wanted, thinking he could control the narrative, control the outcome. But Sophie's world was never something he could control. It was something he had to learn to accept, to step into, and to be a part of. As the evening wore on, Jack couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, not just between them, but within him. The walls around his heart were starting to crumble, piece by piece, and he had no idea where it would lead. Jack sat in the quiet of his office, the weight of the day's discovery pressing down on his chest. He had always thought of himself as a man who understood the world, who had worked hard, played the game, and built his success on the foundations of hard work and determination. But today, something had shifted. His view of the world of his own family had been irrevocably changed. The conversation had come out of nowhere. Jack had bumped into an old family friend, a woman named Janet, at a coffee shop downtown. She had been a frequent visitor to his family home when he was younger, someone who knew both his parents well. At first, it had been a simple, pleasant exchange of pleasantries. Janet had been quick to congratulate him on his latest business deal, and Jack had reciprocated with a smile. But as they continued talking, the conversation turned unexpectedly personal. It wasn't long before Janet had spoken of Sophie. Sophie, the woman Jack had been avoiding facing for years, the one whose life he had abandoned, the mother of his daughters. Janet's words had been like a slow leak, letting the truth seep through cracks that Jack hadn't even known existed. "Sophie," Janet had said, sipping her coffee, her voice lowering to a whisper as if sharing a secret. "She's been through more than you can imagine. Jack, more than you'll ever know." Jack had shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't want to talk about Sophie, not here, not now, but something in Janet's voice made him listen. He had asked, casually at first, what she meant, and Janet had hesitated. Then, without warning, she dropped the bombshell. "You know," Janet said, looking around as if ensuring no one was listening. Your father was responsible for destroying Sophie's family. He took everything from them. Everything. And Sophie's never been the same since." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. He had leaned forward, desperate for clarification, for some kind of explanation. But Janet's words had already settled in his mind, leaving him stunned, unable to speak. Jack had always known that his father had made some questionable decisions in business, but he had never imagined that those decisions had hurt Sophie in such a profound way. Sophie had always kept her pain to herself, never once revealing the depth of the damage Jack's father had caused her family. He had never known. But now, in this quiet coffee shop, surrounded by the soft hum of background noise, he understood just how deeply his own blood had destroyed the life of the woman he loved. His mind raced as the truth settled in, piece by piece. He had been so consumed with his own life, his own ambitions, that he had never once stopped to consider the consequences of his father's actions on the people around him. Sophie had paid the price for something Jack's father had done, and Jack had been too blind to see it. As he sat there, trying to process the revelation, Jack felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. His hands shook slightly, gripping the edge of his coffee cup as the full magnitude of the situation dawned on him. He had never asked Sophie about her past, about her struggles. He had never bothered to understand the pain she had carried, the scars she had hidden from the world. But now, everything had changed. The pain he had caused, both by his neglect and by his father's actions, was more than he could bear. Later that evening, Jack made his way to Sophie's apartment, his mind racing with questions and a deep, gnawing sense of guilt. He needed to see her, to understand her side of the story, to apologize, to make things right. But when he arrived, Sophie was not there. He waited for hours, pacing the small living room, his thoughts spinning wildly as he replayed every moment of their relationship, wondering where he had gone wrong. When Sophie finally arrived, her tired eyes met his with an expression he couldn't quite read. She stepped into the apartment and paused, noticing his anxious demeanor. There was an almost imperceptible hesitation between them, an unspoken distance that neither of them had been able to bridge. "Sophie," Jack began, his voice raw, "I need to talk to you. I found out something today, something I never knew. I had no idea how much my father hurt you and your family. I need to understand. Please tell me what happened." Sophie stood still for a moment, her back to him, and then, with a heavy sigh, she turned to face him. Her face was lined with exhaustion, the weight of years of silent suffering now apparent. For a long time, there was only silence between them, thick with unspoken words. "I never wanted you to know," she said quietly. "I never wanted you to feel responsible for something that wasn't your fault. But now you do, don't you? Now you see it. Your father." She trailed off, her voice trembling. "He took everything from us. Everything." Jack's chest tightened. He wanted to speak, wanted to apologize, but words felt hollow. Sophie's pain, her anger. It was too much for him to fully understand. How could he have been so blind? Sophie's eyes locked with his, and for the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to be vulnerable. "You are the son of the man who destroyed my family," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Everything we had, he took it. And you, Jack, you had no idea. You had no idea what your father did to me, to us, to—" Jack opened his mouth to speak, but the words stuck in his throat. There was nothing he could say that could make up for the years of pain Sophie had endured. He had abandoned her once, and now he felt like he was losing her again. Sophie looked at him, her face hardening. "You can't fix this, Jack. You can't fix what's been broken for so long." Her voice wavered for a moment, and then she added, "But you can try to make it right, if you really want to." There was no anger in her tone, only resignation. The reality of the situation settled in like a heavy fog, and Jack could feel it suffocating him. He was trapped in the weight of his father's legacy, trapped in the damage done long before he had any say in the matter. "I don't know how to make it right," Jack whispered, "but I have to try." Sophie's eyes softened, but there was still a distance between them, a chasm that Jack couldn't cross. She turned away from him slowly, her footsteps echoing in the quiet room. "You can try, Jack," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "but don't expect me to wait for you." As she walked away, Jack stood motionless, the truth crashing down on him like a wave he couldn't escape. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of the damage he had caused and the distance he still had to travel to repair it. Jack stared out the window of his office, the glass cold beneath his fingertips, his mind swirling with the revelation that had shattered his world only days ago. Sophie's words echoed in his mind, a constant hum he couldn't shake. She had made it clear that he wasn't welcome, that he couldn't erase the damage done, not just to her, but to everything she had built in the years since their divorce. Yet, despite the heavy burden of guilt he carried, Jack couldn't ignore the pull in his chest, the relentless drive to right his wrongs. The past few days had been a blur. His office had been filled with business deals and high-stakes decisions, but every time Jack tried to focus on his work, he found his eyes drawn to the photographs on his desk. The images of his two daughters, their faces so similar to his own, haunted him. He couldn't erase the guilt that gnawed at him. All those years, all that time spent pretending like he was content with his life, while Sophie had carried the weight of the world on her shoulders. It had taken a shocking revelation, an unwanted truth about his father's role in Sophie's suffering, to jolt him awake. And now, it was clear. He couldn't keep running. Sophie had closed herself off from him, and for good reason. Jack had been too absorbed in his world to even notice her struggles, her sacrifices. She had kept the pain of her past buried deep inside, not because she wanted to, but because she had no choice. Jack had abandoned her, and in doing so, had abandoned their children. He had known that she was raising their daughters alone, but he never fully understood the weight of it until now. Now, the reality of what his father had done, what he had allowed to happen, sat heavy on his chest, like a weight he couldn't escape. But instead of wallowing in his guilt, Jack had made a decision. He would do whatever it took to make things right. The first step, he realized, was not to apologize with words, but with actions. He couldn't undo the past, but he could try to make amends. And so, Jack had quietly begun to help. He volunteered in the community, working with local organizations Sophie had been a part of. He visited the places that Sophie had helped build, the shelters, the outreach programs, the places where people like her had dedicated their lives to helping those less fortunate. He made sure to remain anonymous, not seeking praise, but doing the work he knew needed to be done. It was a small step, but it was his. It wasn't about showing Sophie how much he cared for her. It was about showing her that he understood the importance of what she had done, that he respected it, and that he was willing to take responsibility for his own role in the destruction of her life. He knew Sophie wouldn't accept his apologies not yet, but he hoped that through his actions, she would see that he was serious, that he wasn't the same man he had been when they were together. But even as Jack worked to make things right, Sophie remained distant. She hadn't spoken to him since their last confrontation, and he had respected her space. Still, he couldn't help but feel that a small part of her recognized the changes in him, the way he had quietly worked to fix the problems he had caused, the way he had stepped up in ways he never had before. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. One evening, as Jack sat in his office, reviewing some documents for a new project, he received a message that caught him completely off guard. It was from Sophie's mother, a woman he hadn't spoken to in years. The message was brief, but its meaning was clear. "Jack, I know you've been trying to make up for the past, but I want you to know that Sophie has noticed. She sees the changes in you, but she's not ready to forgive you. And she may never be. You can't rush that, but I want you to know that what you're doing is the right thing. It's the only thing you can do now." Jack's fingers hovered over the screen as he read the message. His heart skipped a beat. Sophie's mother had always been a kind, understanding woman, but her words now felt like both a reassurance and a warning. She had acknowledged Jack's efforts, but she had also reminded him that forgiveness wasn't something that could be forced. Sophie had to come to it on her own time. It wasn't about Jack proving himself to her. It was about Sophie finding her own peace with the past. The message was a blow, but also a wake-up call. Jack had been thinking of his actions as a way to gain forgiveness, as if he could undo everything he had done with a few good deeds. But forgiveness wasn't something he could earn through work or charity. It was something that had to come from within, and Sophie was the only one who could give it to him. Jack leaned back in his chair, the weight of the message sinking in. He had been so focused on repairing the damage, on making things right, that he had forgotten the most important lesson of all: redemption wasn't for him to claim. It wasn't something he could force out of Sophie, no matter how much he wanted it. He had to let her find her own way through the pain, her own way back to trust. As Jack processed the message, another thought crossed his mind. He didn't just need forgiveness from Sophie. He needed to forgive himself. He needed to stop running from the truth of what he had done, to stop hiding behind his actions, and face the reality of his mistakes. He had been a coward in so many ways, too afraid to face the consequences of his actions, too afraid to step up when it really mattered. But now, he was ready to face whatever came next, whether Sophie could forgive him or not. The phone buzzed again. It was a message from one of his colleagues. The message was routine, just an update on a business deal, but Jack couldn't focus on it. His mind was elsewhere, caught up in the message from Sophie's mother. He couldn't help but think about what it all meant. He wasn't sure where to go from here, or what Sophie needed from him. But he knew one thing for sure: he couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine, that the past could just be erased with a few good deeds. The work he had been doing wasn't for Sophie, it was for him. It was his way of trying to make amends for a lifetime of mistakes. He glanced at the framed picture of his daughters on his desk, their smiling faces staring back at him. He had hurt them, too, by abandoning their mother. But the message from Sophie's mother had given him something new to think about. Maybe, just maybe, by showing Sophie the man he had become, he could give her the space she needed to heal. And maybe, in time, she would be able to forgive him. But that wasn't something Jack could rush. He had learned that the hard way. The sun was beginning to set over New York City, casting a warm golden hue over the buildings. Jack stood by his window, watching as the city slowly came to life beneath the fading light. But for the first time in weeks, his mind was not on business or the endless meetings that consumed his days. Instead, his thoughts were consumed by the truth, the heavy burden of his past, a truth he could no longer ignore. For years, Jack had been running from the truth, hiding behind his father's name, behind the success that his family had built. He had lived in the shadow of his father's decisions, of his father's mistakes. But now, it was clear that the time for running was over. He had to face the reality of what his father had done to Sophie and her family. He could no longer pretend that the past didn't matter, that the damage his father had caused was someone else's problem. It was his problem now, and it was his responsibility to make it right. The realization hit him like a wave. All these years, he had been living in the comfort of his own world, isolated from the struggles of others, too focused on his own success to see the destruction his father's actions had caused. Sophie had borne the brunt of it, raising their children alone, suffering in silence, while Jack had turned a blind eye. And now, as much as he wished he could undo the damage, he knew that wasn't possible. But what he could do was change. He could prove to Sophie and to himself that he was no longer the man who had abandoned her, the man who had allowed his father's sins to taint their lives. The first step was admitting the truth to himself. Jack knew that he had to change, and it wasn't going to be easy. For years, he had built his life on a foundation of lies, on the comfortable lie that he could distance himself from the mistakes of the past. But the past had a way of catching up with you, whether you were ready for it or not. And now, as Jack stood there, staring out over the city, he knew that he couldn't keep running any longer. The next step was making amends. It wasn't enough to feel guilty, to regret the things he had done, or rather, the things he hadn't done. He had to take action. Jack had quietly begun to visit the places that Sophie had worked to build, the places that had helped so many people in need. He hadn't told Sophie about it. He didn't need to. He wasn't doing it to earn her forgiveness, but because he knew it was the right thing to do. He had spent too many years being selfish, too many years ignoring the pain around him. Now, it was time to give back, to take responsibility for the role his family's wealth and power had played in the destruction of Sophie's life. But despite his efforts, Jack couldn't escape the haunting truth that still lingered. Sophie had never fully trusted him, and who could blame her after all? It was his father who had torn her world apart. Sophie's mother had made it clear that forgiveness was not something that could be rushed, but Jack wasn't looking for immediate redemption. He wasn't looking for Sophie to forgive him right away. He just needed to show her that he had changed, that he was willing to do whatever it took to make things right. In the weeks that followed, Jack found himself growing increasingly restless. He couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he was still falling short. Despite his efforts, Sophie remained distant, unwilling to trust him. It was hard to blame her. The past was too painful, the wounds too deep. And yet, Jack couldn't help but feel that something was changing. Every time he saw her, there was a flicker of something in her eyes, a recognition that maybe, just maybe, he was starting to prove himself. But she wouldn't let herself fully acknowledge it. Not yet. It was at a community event, a fundraiser that Sophie had organized, that Jack felt the shift. He had helped, as he had been doing for the past few weeks. But this time, there was a change in Sophie's demeanor. She didn't seem as guarded, as if she was starting to let him in, even just a little bit. As they worked together on the event, something shifted between them. The awkwardness that had always been there between the man who had failed and the woman who had been left behind began to dissolve. Jack could sense it, though Sophie wasn't ready to admit it. She still held on to her pain, to her distrust. And then came the moment that caught Jack off guard. After the event, they stood together in a quiet corner of the room, watching as the last of the guests filed out. Sophie looked at him, her eyes softening. But there was a sadness there, too, a lingering hurt that she couldn't fully hide. "I don't know if I'll ever forgive you," Sophie said, her voice low and steady. "But I can't keep holding on to this anger. It's not helping anyone." Jack swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words settle on his chest. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something. It was a step in the right direction. And for the first time in a long while, Jack felt a flicker of hope. "I understand," he said softly, his gaze meeting hers. "I don't expect forgiveness, not yet, but I'll keep trying. I'll keep showing you that I've changed, and I'll keep proving that I'm not the same man I was." Sophie didn't say anything else. She didn't have to. The silence between them spoke volumes. She wasn't ready to forgive him, but she wasn't shutting him out anymore, either. It was a small victory. But for Jack, it was everything. As he walked away from the event that night, Jack couldn't help but feel a sense of peace settle over him. He had made progress, but the road ahead was still long. There were no easy answers, no quick fixes. But for the first time in years, Jack felt like he was finally on the right path. Jack never expected his life to take the turn it did when he first met Sophie again. The past few months had been a journey of personal transformation, of peeling back layers of guilt, responsibility, and hope for redemption. At first, he had been caught in the whirlwind of trying to undo the mistakes of his father. But now, as he stood beside Sophie, they had begun something far greater than just mending their fractured past. It all started with a shared understanding. Their bond was no longer about rekindling an old relationship or fixing something broken. It was about creating something new, something meaningful. Sophie had always wanted to help the underprivileged children in the neighborhood, but for years, the resources had been scarce. Jack, with his corporate connections, his financial means, and his newfound drive to make things right, began to see that this could be his opportunity to contribute something that truly mattered. The project they set their sights on was one that felt deeply personal to both of them, building a school for children in the area who had no access to quality education. It wasn't just about the school itself, But the potential it held, the lives it could change, the future it could give to kids who were born into circumstances they didn't choose. They also set up a scholarship fund, aiming to provide opportunities for children from families who couldn't afford the costs of education. The community, initially skeptical about the partnership between Jack and Sophie, began to take notice. Jack had his fair share of critics. His past, especially the role his father played in the community's suffering, still loomed large in many minds. Sophie, though she had learned to trust Jack more, still bore the scars of their past. But together, they pressed on. They worked side by side, Sophie bringing her deep understanding of the community's needs, and Jack contributing with the resources he could provide. Every step was hard-won, and often it felt like the weight of the world was on their shoulders. Yet, each day, they could see the small victories, the smiles of the children as they attended the makeshift classes, the parents who came forward to offer their support, the community slowly embracing what they were trying to accomplish. One morning, Jack arrived at the site of the new school. The structure was beginning to take shape, the foundation poured, the walls rising. As he walked through the partially constructed building, Sophie was already there, speaking with the workers and organizing the next steps. Her voice was steady, authoritative, and yet warm. The very same voice Jack had heard many times before when they discussed their dreams for this place. But today, something felt different. Sophie wasn't just the person in charge of the project. She was the heart and soul of it. She was the one who had brought this vision to life. "You know, Jack," Sophie said, glancing at him as he approached. "It's incredible how much we've accomplished together. It's not perfect yet, but we're getting there." Jack nodded, though his mind was still swirling with the enormity of what they had taken on. He had thrown himself into this project with every bit of his energy, but the truth was that Sophie had been the one driving it all along. She had been the one to inspire him to act, to move past the guilt, and to focus on the good they could do in the present. It wasn't about fixing the past. It was about making a tangible difference in the here and now. Later that day, as the project continued, a group of children gathered around the construction site, peering curiously at the progress. They were the very children Sophie and Jack had set out to help. One of them, a young boy with a wide grin, approached Jack and Sophie with a drawing in his hands. "Here," the boy said, holding out the picture. "It's for you, Mr. Jack." Jack looked down at the paper, seeing the crude but heartfelt drawing of him and Sophie standing side by side in front of the new school. In the drawing, they were holding hands with the children, a symbol of their connection. The image was simple, but it hit Jack hard. In that moment, he realized just how far they had come, not just as partners in this project, but as individuals, trying to do what was right. "Thank you," Jack said, crouching down to meet the boy's eyes. "This is really beautiful." Sophie, standing beside him, smiled softly. "You know, Jack," she said quietly, "this is just the beginning. We've made progress, but we still have a long way to go." Jack felt a lump in his throat. It was true. They were doing something good, but it wasn't enough yet. There were still challenges ahead, obstacles to overcome, and their journey wasn't close to being over. But as he looked at the child's smiling face and Sophie's warm expression, he felt a surge of hope he hadn't experienced in a long time. This was the kind of work that mattered. This was the kind of life he wanted to live, the one that gave back, the one that tried to right the wrongs of the past. As they walked through the site together, discussing the next steps, a small voice from one of the children called out, "When is Mr. Ethan coming back?" The question took Jack by surprise. He turned to Sophie, his brow furrowing slightly. Sophie, sensing his confusion, quickly explained, "Mr. Ethan was one of our teachers who used to work here. He helped us with the kids before we started this project. The children really loved him. They've been asking about him since he left." Jack smiled softly, realizing just how deeply this community was beginning to accept him. The kids, in their innocent way, were starting to see him as a part of their world, as someone who had stepped up to make a difference. And though it wasn't love, it wasn't forgiveness, Either it was something more fundamental. It was a recognition that what they were doing together mattered. It wasn't just about Sophie or Jack. It was about the kids, the community, the future they were building together. But as they walked further into the site, Jack felt the weight of the question on his shoulders. When is Mr. Ethan coming back? The kids had faith in him, perhaps more than he deserved. They believed in the promise of a better future, and they looked to him to deliver it. But Jack knew that the road ahead was far from easy. He had done good work, yes, but there was still so much left to do. There would be obstacles, setbacks, and times when it felt like they might not make it. But now, for the first time, he was ready for that. He was ready to face the hard times because he finally understood what Sophie had been saying all along. It wasn't about perfection. It was about progress. Sophie, noticing his quiet reflection, spoke up. "We're doing the right thing. Jack, you don't need to worry about what anyone else thinks. Just keep showing up. That's all that matters." Jack nodded, feeling her words settle into his heart. It wasn't about getting everything right. It was about showing up every day, doing the work, and trusting that together they could make a difference. As they moved forward with their plans for the school, Sophie and Jack knew that they were on the right path, but that path was just beginning. They had found a common purpose, but it was still just the start. Jack's heart swelled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years, and though they were still just two people trying to make the world a better place, it was clear that they were no longer alone in their efforts. The future was uncertain, but for the first time, it felt full of possibility. The afternoon sun filtered through the trees in the small park outside the community center, casting long shadows on the ground. The sounds of laughter and chatter filled the air, a familiar background hum at every charity event Sophie had ever organized. Jack stood next to her, a steady presence as they observed the children playing in the yard. His eyes softened as he watched a group of them run past, their smiles wide, their excitement palpable. For a moment, he forgot about the past, forgot about the weight of what he had been carrying for so long. This was what mattered now. Sophie caught his gaze, her own expression unreadable. Over the past few weeks, they had both immersed themselves in this project, in this community, in something that felt so far removed from the world of high-rise offices and business deals Jack had once known. They were in the trenches together, and in some ways, it felt like they were both learning to breathe again. Sophie had been steadfast in her resolve to not let her guard down, but even she couldn't deny the change that had been happening between them. Every moment spent working side by side had slowly chipped away at the walls she had built around her heart. Jack felt the shift too. In the beginning, he had been so consumed by guilt, by the weight of his family's past actions, that he couldn't even see what was right in front of him. But as time went on, he realized something he had never known before. He wasn't just here to atone for his past sins. He was here because this felt right. He was here because of Sophie, and because of the future they were building together. The past had its hold on him, but in these moments, it started to loosen its grip. As the afternoon wore on, Sophie had been busy coordinating with volunteers, making sure everything was running smoothly. Jack had spent the majority of his time engaging with the kids, answering their questions, and offering encouragement. His presence, once a source of skepticism, was now welcomed. He had become a part of this community, and it was clear to everyone around him that he was here for more than just a temporary fix. Just as Jack was walking towards Sophie, his eyes scanning the crowd for her, he heard a small voice call out his name. He turned toward the sound, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw a little boy standing just a few feet away, his arms raised in excitement. "Mr. Jack," the boy called again, waving eagerly. Jack walked over, crouching down to meet the child at eye level. "Hey, buddy, what's going on?" Jack asked, his voice soft and kind. The boy grinned widely. "You're like my dad," he said, beaming up at Jack. For a moment, Jack froze. The words didn't immediately register. He looked up at Sophie, who stood there, frozen herself, her eyes wide with shock. The world seemed to slow as Jack felt the weight of what had just been said. The child's innocent statement, simple and unguarded, hit them both with a force neither of them expected. Jack stood up, his mind reeling. Sophie, too, seemed lost for words. It was as if the little boy's innocent proclamation had cracked open something they had both kept locked away for so long. Sophie looked away, her expression faltering, but Jack could see the way her lips tightened, the way her shoulders tensed. It was clear that something deep inside her had shifted. She was beginning to let go. Jack didn't know what to say. The air between them felt thick with unsaid words, heavy with the realization that their relationship had crossed a line neither of them had expected. He turned to the child, offering a warm smile, but his thoughts were elsewhere. He was no longer just the man trying to atone for his father's sins. He was now the man who had found his place in Sophie's world, in these children's lives, in a way he hadn't ever imagined possible. Sophie finally broke the silence, her voice quiet but steady. "You're starting to be more than just an outsider." "Jack," she said, her words cutting through the tension. "You've become someone they look up to." Jack nodded, though his mind was still processing the weight of the boy's words. He had been accepted, yes, but this moment made him realize how deep that acceptance ran. It wasn't just the work he was doing. It was the way they were beginning to see him, not as someone defined by his past mistakes, but as someone who could be part of their future. Sophie took a deep breath, her gaze softening as she looked at him. "I didn't think this was possible," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't think I could trust you again." The words hit Jack hard. He had known that their journey together was going to be difficult, but hearing Sophie admit her fears, her doubts, made him understand just how far they still had to go. He wasn't naive enough to think that everything would be perfect now. Trust, after all, was something that took time to rebuild. But there was something in the way she spoke, something in her eyes, that told him they were getting closer. Jack reached for her hand, his grip firm but gentle. "You don't have to trust me all at once," he said softly. "I'll prove it. Every day. With every choice I make." Sophie's eyes flickered with uncertainty, but she didn't pull away. She was scared, that much was clear, but she wasn't running from him. She was staying, willing to move forward, even if it meant facing the past that had torn them apart. As the day wore on, Jack and Sophie continued working side by side, the tension between them palpable but not unbearable. They were no longer strangers to each other, but they weren't quite ready to cross the threshold into something more either. There was still so much to overcome. Yet, in that moment, Jack could feel something shifting between them. The weight of the past, while never truly gone, no longer held them hostage. They had taken the first step towards something different. Later, as the event drew to a close, Jack and Sophie stood on the steps of the community center, watching the last of the volunteers and children head home. It had been a long day, but Jack could feel the exhaustion settling in with a sense of quiet satisfaction. They had done something good today. They had brought people together, and in doing so, they had begun to rebuild the trust that had been shattered years ago. Sophie turned to him, her face softening as she spoke again, her voice quiet but filled with sincerity. "I don't know when it happened, Jack," she said, "but somewhere along the way, I stopped seeing you as just my past, and I started seeing you as someone I could trust again." Jack met her gaze, his heart swelling with emotions he couldn't fully put into words. He wanted to say something, something that would make this moment feel as significant as it was, but all he could do was smile and nod, grateful for this small step forward. She didn't look back, but he knew. Something had changed. The city lights flickered as Jack stood in the towering office building, staring out the window. The glass was cold against his palm, and the hum of traffic far below seemed to fade as his mind wandered. He could hear the distant echo of his phone, a reminder that his world was changing, shifting in ways he hadn't expected. He had thought that stepping into Sophie's world would be the hardest thing he had ever done. But now, standing in this sleek conference room with the weight of the world on his shoulders, he realized that the true test had only just begun. His phone buzzed again, another text from Sophie. She had asked him if he was ready for the board meeting. She hadn't asked with concern, but with a quiet resolve that made Jack's heart ache. Sophie was strong, and that strength had drawn him in. But it was her vulnerability, the moments when she allowed herself to need someone, that had truly captured him. The meeting today was about more than just business. The board of directors, along with his colleagues, were all deeply aware of the growing rumors surrounding Jack and Sophie. The company's highest echelons had caught wind of their relationship, and they were beginning to question whether Jack's personal choices were clouding his judgment. In the cold world of business, personal lives were to be kept in check. The world Sophie lived in, a world built on compassion and community, was foreign to those Jack had once worked alongside for years. Jack's fingers tightened around his phone. He was being cornered. They were trying to force his hand. And for the first time in years, he found himself questioning everything he had built. Would it all come crashing down? Was he truly ready to lose it all? Just then, the door to the meeting room opened, and Charles, his oldest friend and business partner, walked in with a grim expression. Charles had always been the voice of reason in their partnership, the man who helped Jack navigate the turbulent waters of business. Today, however, his face was drawn tight with concern. "I think we need to talk," Charles said, his voice heavy with something Jack hadn't heard in years: concern. They had shared countless business dealings together, but this felt different. The air between them was thick with unspoken words. Jack nodded, stepping back from the window and turning to face his friend. "You want to talk about the board?" Charles leaned against the table, crossing his arms. "I want to talk about Sophie," he said bluntly. "About you and her. You know this isn't just a personal matter anymore, right?" Jack's heart rate quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He had known this was coming. The question wasn't whether he'd be asked about his personal life. It was whether he'd be expected to choose between his family and the company. "Charles, I don't have time for this," Jack said, his voice tight. "Sophie and I are doing something important here. It's not just about me or her. It's about the community we're building, the people we're helping. I'm not going to back down." Charles sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I know you're trying to do the right thing, but you're too close to it. You're letting your personal life interfere with your professional responsibilities." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "I'm trying to protect you, Jack. The board is losing faith. Your personal involvement is starting to hurt the company. This could damage everything you've worked for." Jack's jaw clenched. He could feel the pressure building, but something inside him snapped. He wasn't going to let this man, his friend, force him into a corner. He had already chosen, he just hadn't realized it yet. "You think I'm jeopardizing everything?" Jack's voice was low, but firm. "Well, maybe that's exactly what needs to happen." Charles raised an eyebrow, surprised by the intensity in Jack's voice. "What are you saying?" Jack stood up straight, looking directly at Charles. "I'm not choosing between Sophie and the company. I'm going to rebuild everything. If that's what it takes, then that's what I'll do. I'm done pretending I don't care. I'm done pretending I can keep running from what matters." For a moment, Charles didn't say anything. He stared at Jack, clearly shocked by the declaration. It wasn't just the words, but the conviction behind them that took him by surprise. Jack had always been pragmatic, a man of logic and reason, but here, standing in front of him, was a man who had found something more important than profit and power. He had found purpose. Charles shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips, though it was tinged with sadness. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" he asked quietly. "You're willing to risk everything." "I don't need to risk everything." "Charles," Jack replied, his tone softer but no less resolute. "I'm going to build something new, something better, and if that means stepping away from everything I've known, then so be it." The room fell silent for a moment, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. Charles took a deep breath and nodded, the understanding between them shifting. "I'm not going to stop you." "Jack, Charles said, his voice quiet. But don't expect me to watch it all burn down. I'm not asking you to, Jack said, his voice steady. I'm asking you to trust me. Charles paused, then nodded again, though it was clear he wasn't convinced. I hope you know what you're doing. Jack gave him a small, determined smile. I do. As Charles left the room, Jack sat back down at the desk, his thoughts racing. He wasn't sure where this path would lead, but one thing was clear: he couldn't keep hiding. He couldn't keep living a life of half-truths, pretending to be something he wasn't. He had a chance now, an opportunity to build a future with Sophie and the community, one that didn't revolve around his past mistakes. The phone buzzed again, and Jack glanced down at the screen. Another message from Sophie. His heart skipped a beat. Are you ready for this? It asked. Jack smiled to himself, his finger hovering over the keyboard. He wasn't ready for everything, but he was ready for this. With one final deep breath, he typed, I'm ready, I'll see you soon. And with that, he pressed send, knowing that whatever came next, he would face it with his eyes wide open. No more hiding, no more pretending. The sunlight pierced through the early morning mist as Jack stood at the edge of the newly renovated community center. His gaze swept over the area, now vibrant and full of life. The hum of children playing, the laughter of parents and volunteers. It was all so different from the desolate, run-down building that had once stood in its place. Jack had often wondered if it would ever happen. Would he ever feel like he truly made a difference today, standing amidst the people whose lives were touched by his work? The answer was clear. Sophie was by his side, her presence comforting, as she had been through everything. The two of them had come a long way since they first met, and yet today felt like the beginning of something new. They had done something important together, not because they were forced to, but because they both believed in it. Jack's role in this community felt like more than just a man trying to redeem himself. It was the realization of his values and his ability to make a tangible difference in the world. I never thought I'd be standing here, Jack said quietly, looking at the children running around, their faces full of excitement. This is what I needed, what we needed. Sophie smiled softly, squeezing his hand. I think we both needed this, Jack. It's not just about what we've built, but about what we've become. The ribbon-cutting ceremony had been a success. Local dignitaries had shown up, but it was the children's smiles and the warmth of the community that made the event unforgettable. There were a lot of speeches, a lot of praise, but none of it mattered to Jack as much as the moment he was living in right now. It wasn't the accolades that had changed him, but the people he had worked alongside, the ones whose lives were made a little brighter because of what they had all built together. As they watched the children play, Jack realized something he hadn't quite understood before. He had been looking for redemption, yes, but there was something even more profound that he had found: connection. In the faces of the children, in the laughter, in the quiet moments spent with Sophie. Jack found a sense of belonging he hadn't known he was missing. This wasn't just a community center, it was the foundation of a new chapter in his life, one that went beyond business meetings and high-stakes decisions. It was about people, about families, and the simple truth that what you give to others, you get back in ways you couldn't always predict. The children gathered around a table near the back, drawing on large sheets of paper, their eyes bright with curiosity. Jack noticed one young girl, no older than 7 or 8, holding up a picture she had drawn. Her small face was filled with excitement as she rushed over to show him. Jack bent down, taking in the colorful image. She had created a picture of him and Sophie, standing side by side with the children they had helped. The warmth in his chest deepened as the girl smiled shyly, her small fingers clutching the edge of the paper. I made this for you, she said, her voice soft but full of pride. You're a hero. Jack's heart skipped a beat, his eyes briefly meeting Sophie's. For a moment, everything around him fell away. The pressures, the doubts, the regrets, they all seemed distant in that brief but profound exchange. It was in that simple act, That picture from a child who didn't know the complexities of his past, that Jack felt something unspoken acceptance, not just from Sophie or from the community, but from the world. He was a part of something. He had made a real, tangible difference. Sophie squeezed his hand once more, and as they stood together, watching the children continue to play and create, Jack knew that his journey had come full circle. He didn't need to be a hero to feel validated. The work, the effort, the relationships they had brought him the peace he had longed for. But it was in Sophie's gaze, the way she looked at him now, that he found the real answer. They had been through so much, yet somehow they had arrived here, together, with everything they had built and experienced behind them. Jack's voice was low, but his words felt like a final revelation. I don't need fame. I just need to be part of her world. And now, I am. Thus, Sophie's expression softened, a tear glistening in the corner of her eye as she looked at him. You're already more than that, Jack. You're my family. You're everything I never knew I needed. The children's laughter, the soft music playing from a nearby speaker, the gentle hum of voices, it was all part of the picture. Jack could feel Sophie's hand still in his, the connection between them stronger than ever before. The walls that had once separated them were gone now, replaced with an unspoken understanding. They had made this together, and it was real. But even as Jack felt the warmth of the moment, he knew there was still a long road ahead. They had reached a milestone, but the work was never truly done. There were always more children to help, more people to support, more lives to touch. As the last of the ribbon was cut, Jack and Sophie shared one last look, the weight of what they had accomplished finally settling in. But there was something else too, a quiet realization that they had just begun. I'm proud of us, Jack said, his voice firm, though there was a softness in his tone. Sophie smiled again, her eyes filled with a warmth that went beyond just the moment. So am I, she replied, her voice steady and strong. The music faded into the background, the voices of the crowd growing quieter as Jack and Sophie stood side by side, watching the children play, and in that moment, with the community gathered around them, Jack knew one thing for certain. He had found the family he had always wanted, not in the form of wealth or recognition, but in the people he had helped, in the love he had shared, and in the simple, profound act of building something better together. They didn't need anything else. They had everything they ever wanted. Months passed since the ribbon-cutting ceremony at the newly renovated community center. The work Jack and Sophie had poured into the project had begun to bear fruit in ways neither of them had fully expected. The community was thriving in ways that spoke louder than any words could. The children who once struggled in the shadows of their circumstances now had opportunities. The center had become a beacon of hope, a place where people found not just services, but a sense of belonging. Now, it was time to celebrate. Jack and Sophie had organized a small exhibition to showcase the children's art and the fruits of their labor, the collaboration between them and the community. It was a celebration of everything they had worked for, and as Jack stood among the visitors, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of pride in everything they had accomplished. The air was filled with laughter, the soft murmur of conversations, and the hum of excitement. But even amidst the joy, there was a sense of peaceful satisfaction that felt different from anything Jack had ever known. This was it, the moment when all their struggles had finally turned into something tangible, something real. As Jack stood admiring the artwork on display, a young girl came up to him, her face bright with excitement. "Mr. Blake, where is Sophie? She's not here yet." Jack smiled gently, his eyes scanning the room. It was then that he saw her, standing at the far corner of the room, a small group of children gathered around her. Sophie wore an apron, decorated with childlike drawings of houses, trees, and stick figures, a playful reminder of the lives they had touched. She was laughing, her eyes alight with the kind of joy that Jack hadn't seen in her before. He watched as she bent down to listen to one of the children, her face soft with attention, her movements graceful. She looked happy. truly happy, in a way that Jack had never known her to be. Without a word, Jack made his way toward her, his heart lighter with each step. As he approached, Sophie turned to face him, her smile lighting up her face. There was no need for a grand declaration, no need for applause or acknowledgement. The connection between them, now solid and unspoken, was clear in the way she met his gaze. "Everything looks amazing," Jack said quietly, his voice steady but filled with emotion. He didn't need to say more. Sophie had always known what he meant. "I know," Sophie replied, her smile widening. "It's all because of them, the kids, the community. But mostly, you and me." There was something in her eyes, a quiet understanding, a bond forged not by words, but by actions, by the work they had done together. Jack felt the weight of it, the depth of it, settle in his chest. It was enough. It always had been. Sophie stepped closer, brushing a hand over his, and for a moment, the noise of the exhibition faded. All that was left was the quiet hum of their connection, the simple knowing that they had made it through everything together. They had found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances, and now they stood side by side, no longer as two strangers, but as something more: partners, friends, and something even deeper. "I think we're ready," Sophie said softly, her gaze meeting his, her voice steady and filled with certainty. Jack didn't speak right away. Instead, he squeezed her hand gently. They had built something here together, more than just a community center or a project. They had built a future, a life that they had both fought for, not because of the circumstances they had faced, but because of the decisions they made along the way. They stood there for a long moment, side by side, taking in the life that surrounded them, the children playing, the families enjoying the day, the art that filled the walls. It was all a reflection of the work they had done. And though the future was still uncertain, Jack felt a peace settle over him, a peace that told him he had found the one thing he had been searching for all his life, a place to belong. As they watched the children, one of them, a boy no older than 8, came rushing up to them, holding something in his hands. Jack bent down, smiling warmly. The boy handed him a small sculpture, its edges rough but carefully crafted, a dancer in motion, a symbol of growth, movement, and hope. "Thank you for everything, Mr. Blake," the boy said, his eyes shining with gratitude. "This is for you and Sophie." The gift was simple, yet profound. Jack felt a lump in his throat as he held it in his hands. It wasn't just the sculpture, but the meaning behind it. It was a token of the change they had made, a symbol of the lives they had touched. Sophie looked at him, her eyes filled with emotion. "We've come so far, haven't we?" Jack nodded, unable to find the words. Instead, he simply turned to her, his voice quiet but resolute. "I'm staying. I'm here. Sophie, I'm not going anywhere." For a moment, there was nothing but silence between them. No more need for grand declarations or words to fill the space. The truth was in the air between them, in the way they stood together, in the way they both understood that what they had created was worth more than anything they could have ever imagined. As the day wore on and the final guests began to leave, Jack and Sophie found themselves alone in the room. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm golden light over everything, and the sounds of the children had quieted down to a soft murmur. They didn't need to speak. The moment was enough. They had both found what they were looking for, and though the road ahead would not always be easy, they knew they had everything they needed to face it together. Jack turned to Sophie, a soft smile on his face. "We did it," he said quietly. Sophie smiled back, her heart full. "We're not done yet, Jack, but we're on the right path." And in that moment, Jack knew something had shifted. They didn't need to say anything more. They didn't need to explain anything. All they needed was the quiet understanding between them that spoke louder than words ever could. As the sun set behind the quiet streets, Jack and Sophie stood side by side, not needing to say a word. There, amidst the faded echoes of what had been Something new had quietly taken root. It wasn't grand, nor loud. It was just two people choosing to stay, even when leaving might have been easier. In the distance, the laughter of children drifted through the air, small, yet profound. Life had a way of moving forward, even when the scars of the past still lingered. And maybe that was enough to walk through the hardest days and still find moments to believe in tomorrow. What if we didn't need to fix everything? What if just showing up was the most we could do?